The sentence of the court upon you is that you suffer death in the manner authorized by law. And may the Lord have mercy on your soul. And so behind these walls, in awful secrecy, the servants of the public carry out the public will.
Henry Pierrepoint, who also went by the name Harry. He was born in Nottinghamshire in 1878 to Thomas and Anne Pierrepoint. In 1891, his family moved to Clayton, a town close to Bradford in Yorkshire, where his father had found work looking after quarry horses. Harry's father found him work as an apprentice butcher, where he stayed for 3 years. As a teenager, Henry read about the exploits of the well-known Bradford executioner James Berry, whose career as the country's leading hangman had come to an infamous end after a series of botched executions. But for Harry, the idea of becoming an executioner stuck with him. For years he read all the exploits of hangmen in the newspapers, keeping a close eye on James Billington, the hangman responsible for executing Charles Thomas Woodridge, who was immortalised in Oscar Wilde's poem The Ballad of Reading Gaol, and Dr. Thomas Neil Cream, the serial killer who poisoned at least 10 people, and whose alleged final words of "I am Jack the" were tantalisingly cut short by Billington's noose, teasing a conclusion to the great mystery of Jack the Ripper's true identity. In the meantime, Henry left and moved to Manchester, where his sister worked in a cabinet-making firm, and he started work there making cabinets. While there, he would meet his future bride, Mary Buxton, and they married in 1898. They settled into married life and went on to have children. At the age of 24, Henry apparently wrote to the then Home Secretary on a number of occasions, and in 1901 he wrote, "I wish to inform you that I should be very thankful if you would accept me as one of the public executioners, should at any time Mr. Billington's term expires, as I have always had a desire for that appointment. I am 24 years of age, height 5 foot 8.5 inches. Should you require particulars of my character, I should be very glad to give you all the information you require, hoping the application will be of no offence." On the 11th of February 1901, Harry was interviewed at Strangeways in Manchester. Within weeks he had started his training. Apparently, at this time, the prison services were constantly looking for executioners, as nobody seemed to be applying for the role. It was the beginning of the Pierrepoint name becoming one of the most prominent names in British criminology. In 1886, a committee was set up on the orders of Queen Victoria to Lord Aberdare, which resulted in the Aberdare Report. It dictated changes in the way executions would be carried out. When the Aberdare Report came out, it showed shockingly cruel and inefficient ways capital punishment had been carried out, often being bungled in some awful way. So a quicker and less painful method was looked into. An official table of drops was produced, listing how far a person of a particular weight should be dropped when hanged to ensure an instant death by cleanly breaking the neck. From then on, the training of new executioners became intense, practising over and over with a sack full of measured sand or a dummy. Henry's first commission was at Newgate, where he assisted the man he had admired for some time, James Billington, at the execution of French anarchist and murderer Marcel Fougeron on the 19th of November 1901. The execution team consisted of Billington, his 2 sons and Henry. They spent the night before sleeping in the cell next to the Frenchman, and Henry watched as the man paced all night. As his time grew closer, and after a large last meal, he was allowed a final walk in the fresh air. At 8 the team entered the cell. They clasped the man's arms, apparently it's called pinioning, and marched him to the execution chamber. The noose was placed over his head. Apparently, Fougeron showed no fear as Billington pushed the lever. The trapdoor opened and he fell to his death. Henry had kept his nerve. He hadn't faltered. He felt no fear. This was the first of 849 executions the Pierrepoints would be involved with. Between 1901 and 1910, according to the Home Office list, Henry assisted at 35 hangings and carried out 70 executions as principal. 63 in England and Wales, 4 in Ireland, 2 in Scotland, and 1 on Jersey during his 9-year term of office. He also assisted Billington and his sons at the first hangings in the newly created women's prison at Holloway. That of the Finchley baby farmers Amelia Satch and Annie Walters on the 3rd of February 1903. Between January 1902 and March 1903, he assisted at a further 15 hangings. His first successful lead role as executioner was in 1902, when he hung Richard Wigley, who had killed his girlfriend. James Billington died in 1905, and tragically his oldest son died a few weeks later. That same year, Henry became the principal executioner in Britain and would perform the 8 executions in Britain the following year, with what many would say in his emotionless but methodical way, recording each hanging in his diary. His methods were said to be precise and quick, measuring the drop so the process went smoothly and without any bungling at all. But Henry would, on a rare occasion, show some emotion. When a soldier returning home from the Boer War found his wife had been cheating and he killed her, then his 5-year-old daughter, who he feared would grow up like her. After the execution, Henry wrote in his diary that he was the bravest man he had ever hanged. Henry's brother, Thomas Pierrepoint, who was 7 years older than him, was at the time working as a quarryman. Henry, knowing of the shortage of executioners, asked his brother if he wanted to join him. At that time, a busy executioner would earn far more than a quarryman. So Thomas was taken under his younger brother's wing, with an intense practice of using rope and bags of corn before assisting his brother. Over the years, the profession started to take its toll on him, which to me shows that those emotions he had had to hide without a form of release became too difficult to hide, the solace of alcohol becoming the medicine to help subdue his pain and his emotions. In 1910, the day before an execution, the team arrived as usual at Chelmsford Prison. Henry didn't see him himself. In fact, files recently released say Henry was considerably the worse for drink and had got into a fight with John Ellis, his assistant, that afternoon. According to the chief warder, as his officers were handing over the prisoner's details, Pierrepoint suddenly opened a volley of abuse at his assistant, John Ellis. Both men had arrived the afternoon before the hanging as usual. Ellis, Slater wrote, "He rushed at me and knocked me out of the chair I was sat on. I got up, but was again knocked off. He was going for me again when Warder Nash, who had heard the noise, came in and attempted to stop him, but failed, and the blow struck me behind the ear." Ellis claimed that he had advised Pierrepoint to drink less as it gave the public the impression he had to drink to do his work. Though one witness said the execution the following day was carried out without most extraordinary dispatch, Henry Pierrepoint was nonetheless removed from the list of approved executioners. The Home Office officials wrote that he should never be employed again. Henry Pierrepoint died on the 14th of December 1922. His son Albert would follow in his father's footsteps. Thomas Pierrepoint, obviously also born in Nottingham, later in Clayton, he met and married Elizabeth Binns in Bradford on the 5th of December 1891. It would seem he kept his career pretty much to himself, as did his brother Henry. Friends remember him only as a kindly older gentleman, quietly spoken and with a good sense of humour. He lived quietly at 14 Backfold, Townend, Clayton, where his wife Lizzie had a shop. He kept mules and chickens and goats, and also ran a haulage firm and a bookmaking business. Occasionally he would disappear for a couple of days without saying much to anyone. By all accounts, he lived a very quiet life. Thomas Pierrepoint remained as executioner for 40 years, from 1906 to 1946. He assisted at 35 executions and carried out 203 civilian hangings in England and Wales, and 4 in Scotland. Thomas was the official executioner for the Irish Republic after it gained independence from England in 1923, and carried out 27 executions at Dublin's Mountjoy prison. During World War II, he was appointed by the US military in Europe to execute 16 US soldiers who were convicted of and murder. At the Shepton Mallet prison in Somerset, Thomas and his nephew Albert hung the 16 US military personnel. Thomas was also flown to France in 1944 to hang a US serviceman who had been convicted of Thomas retired in 1946 and died on the 10th of February 1954, aged 83. Then came the most famous of the Pierrepoint family, Albert, son of Henry and nephew of Thomas. He was born at 5 Green End in Clayton in 1905. He was the eldest of 3 children and was very close to his uncle Thomas, spending a lot of his days at his uncle and aunt's house. As a child, he didn't know what his father and his uncle did, and didn't question where they were when they were away from home for a night. But when he was later told in his early life, he became very interested in the family business. And in 1930, a few years after his father Henry had died, and encouraged by his uncle, he applied to the Home Office to be placed on the official executioners list, but he was informed that there was no vacancies at the time. To make ends meet, he took on delivery jobs for a local business and eventually becoming the manager of that business. In the meantime, he studied his father's books and diaries that he'd written when he was the principal executioner. He would eventually follow his father's stoic dedication. In 1932, he received a letter asking him to attend an interview at Strangeways Prison in Manchester. He was offered the place of assistant executioner after an intense week of training. He went on to assist his uncle and showed himself to be respectful, calm and courteous to his customers, as he liked to call them. Albert didn't get to perform many executions in the 30s, as there wasn't many. His first lone execution came in 1941, when he hanged gangster and murderer, the Brighton trunk killer, Antonio Mancini in London. The following year, he executed the notorious spree killer, Gordon Cummins, the Blackout Ripper, believed to have murdered and mutilated 4 women over the course of 6 days in February of 1942. Albert managed to separate his emotions from his work. He had a job to do and he intended to do it with great care. After all, it was a human's life they were taking. He saw the act of execution as the prisoner's sentence served. They had paid for their crime and their body would be handled with respect after. He didn't even tell his wife, Annie, until a few weeks into their marriage what he did. Albert went to great lengths to make sure the hangings went as quickly and humanely as possible, checking weight and heights to make sure they had measured the rope length accurately and had the right weight attached. He also made sure the knot was placed on the left, making for a clean break rather than a decapitation. He wanted an instant death, not suffocation, so the prisoner would die with dignity. The whole process would, in his own words, become sacred to him. After World War II, Albert's workload increased. He was asked by General Sir Bernard Montgomery to preside over the executions of war criminals in Germany. Working at Hamelin Prison in the British-controlled sector of Germany between 1945 and 1949, he performed 201 executions, including 149 men and 10 women who were convicted of war crimes, 40 for civilian crimes, plus 2 British soldiers convicted of murder. The most notable of this series of executions was the first batch, which took place on the 13th of December 1945, when he hanged 13 prisoners at Hamelin. They were 11 members of staff from the Belsen concentration camp, including Irma Gries, who was a teenager, Elizabeth Volkenrath, and Joanna Bormann. Also, Joseph Kramer, the Beast of Belsen, the commandant of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. In January 1946, he hanged American-born Nazi propagandist William Joyce, aka Lord Haw-Haw, for high treason. General Montgomery let Albert's name slip in an interview and told of Albert's responsibilities while he was there. Albert was met by reporters and photographers, all wanting to interview the man who hung the Beast of Belsen. He became celebrated for his part in seeing the demise of many war criminals. Up to now, Albert and his wife had lived a quiet, normal life. Most people didn't know his form of work. To all his friends, they were just a normal, happy couple who had decided to run their own pub, the Help the Poor Struggler in Manchester, something they had been wanting to do for a while. But they were suddenly thrown into the spotlight. It was just before Christmas in 1945 that the 13 Nazi criminals were hung. And every Christmas for many years after that, Albert received a Christmas card containing a £5 note. And in that card was just one word: Belsen. The serial killer John George Hay, the famous acid bath murderer, came Albert's way on the 10th of August 1949 at Wandsworth Prison. He had killed 6 women. He hung the man wrongly accused of murder of his wife and child, Timothy Evans. When the man responsible for the deaths was caught in 1953, serial killer John Christie, who killed 7 women, stood at the gallows and complained that his nose itched. Albert leaned in and told him quietly, "It won't bother you for long." After being seen as a hero for some time, Albert began to see the change in the public's attitude towards capital punishment. He began to feel awkward about his profession. But on Tuesday, the 28th of November 1950, Albert hanged a man called James Corbett at Strangeways in Manchester for the murder of his girlfriend. But Corbett had been a regular at Albert's pub, and they had even sang together on a Saturday night. They had nicknames for each other apparently, Tish and Tosh. It's said that Albert didn't have a clue who he was about to hang before he arrived on the Monday before the execution. When he went to his cell the next morning, they greeted each other by their nicknames. On the 13th of July 1955 at Holloway Prison, Ruth Ellis became the last woman to be hanged in Britain for the murder of her boyfriend, and it was Albert Pierrepoint who performed her execution. Because she was a woman who had killed an abusive boyfriend while clearly in a state of extreme stress, Ellis's death sentence was extremely controversial among the British public, to the point that the government's view on capital punishment began to change. Albert would also express some personal reservations about the value of capital punishment. Albert Pierrepoint performed his last execution on the 27th of July 1955, when he hung Norman Green, who had stabbed 2 children to death on 2 separate occasions. On a bitter cold January day in 1956, Albert made his way to Strangeways for the execution of Thomas Bancroft. But at the last minute, Bancroft was reprieved. Albert claimed the full fee, which was around £15, which is equivalent to about £200 now. He was only paid £1, and he was angry that this wouldn't even cover his expenses. He appealed to his employers, the prison committee, who declined to get involved. A final settlement of £4 was paid by the sheriff. But Albert was angry and he felt insulted, so he resigned. And that was the end of Albert Pierrepoint's career as Britain's most famous #1 official executioner. Albert and his wife retired to Southport, where Albert died on July the 10th, 1992, at the age of 87. Capital punishment was abolished in Great Britain in 1965.
My name is Albert Pierrepoint, and I was executioner for 25 years. Here are a few notes on what happens when a man is to be executed. When a man is to be executed, I and my assistant must get to the prison by 4 o'clock on the day before the execution. And we have to stay there until it is over. We are told the height and weight of the prisoner and are given an opportunity to see him at exercise or in his cell or from some point where he cannot see us. Having got the idea of his physique, we can make the proper preparation for his execution. The execution chamber is usually next door to the condemned cell. It is a small room with a trap in the centre of the floor. The bag is filled with sand and we rehearse the drop to see that is all in order. The prisoner is out of his cell while we are doing this, so that he does not hear the noise of what we are doing. We leave the bag hanging to stretch the rope overnight and go off to our room to wait until next morning. When it is time for the execution, we make a final check of the equipment. Then we wait outside the condemned cell for the signal of the sheriff to go in. I used to arrange that the prisoner has his back to us when I come in case he might get excited. Then when I am inside, I fasten his arms behind his back with a leather strap. Then the prisoner is escorted out of the condemned cell into the execution chamber and is placed on a white chalk mark so that his feet are across the division of the trap. While my assistant is fastening up his legs, I draw a white cap over his head and place a noose round his neck. The knot is a secret of it. We have to put it on the left lower jaw, and if we have it on the side, when he falls, it finishes underneath the chin and throws the chin back. But if the knot is on the right-hand side, it would finish up behind his neck and throw his neck forward, which would be strangulation. He might live on the rope for a quarter of an hour then. As soon as I see that everything is ready, I pull the lever and the prisoner falls through it, and it is all over in an instant.